Emily had been enjoying a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sunlight pours softly through the kitchen windows, casting golden patterns on the countertops and making the room feel warm and safe. She hummed a little tune as she wiped down the dishes, stacking them carefully, feeling a rare moment of peace. The house was unusually still. David, her husband, was away on a work call, and even the usual background noise of the city outside seemed muted. For a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to breathe without the usual tension that often lingered in the house, the kind that came from the unspoken pressures of managing a blended family. Her mind wandered briefly to memories of when she and David had first met, how their lives had intertwined in ways that were exciting and complicated at the same time. She remembered the first time she had met Michael, David's teenage son, and how awkward yet intriguing that initial meeting had been. The way Michael's eyes had studied her as though trying to read her completely, a quiet intelligence and caution behind them. Lost in her thoughts, Emily almost didn't hear the soft footstep behind her at first, but then it came again, deliberate yet hesitant, breaking the calm she had been enjoying. She turned slightly, wiping her hands on a towel, and saw Michael leaning casually against the counter, though there was tension in the set of his shoulders, a seriousness in his gaze that made Emily pause immediately. He looked older than she remembered, his face carrying a quiet concern, a weight beyond his years, and for a moment Emily felt a pang of worry. "Emily," he began, his voice soft and uncertain, "can I ask you something about Dad?" The words were simple, but the way he said them carried a weight that made Emily's heart skip. She motioned for him to sit at the kitchen table, unsure of what exactly he wanted to know, but sensing that whatever it was, it mattered to him deeply. He hesitated, his hands twisting nervously, and Emily felt a surge of protectiveness toward him, a desire to reassure him before she even knew what question would come. Michael took a deep breath, glancing briefly at the window as if searching for courage in the sunlight, then looked back at her. "It's just, I've noticed some things, and I don't know who else to talk to," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, encouraging him to continue without pressing too hard, letting him take the lead in this delicate moment. He began to explain the subtle changes he had noticed in his father over the past few months. The longer hours at work, the hushed phone calls, the distant tone in conversations that once had been warm and easy. He spoke carefully, choosing words that revealed both his confusion and his worry, and Emily listened, feeling a mixture of sympathy, guilt, and apprehension. She had sensed some of these changes herself, the quiet distance that sometimes came between her and David, but hearing it reflected through Michael's innocent and observant eyes made it sharper, more immediate. She realized that this conversation wasn't just about curiosity. It was about a young man trying to make sense of the shifting dynamics in his family, trying to find stability in moments that felt uncertain. Emily reached out, placing her hand gently on his, offering reassurance without overstepping, letting him know that he was safe to speak openly. Michael's eyes, usually so composed, glistened slightly with emotion, and Emily felt the gravity of his unspoken fears, the weight of trust he was placing in her. She encouraged him softly, reminding him that asking questions was not a betrayal, that seeking understanding was a sign of care. And Michael nodded, swallowing hard, a quiet acceptance of her support. Time seemed to slow in that kitchen, the ordinary hum of appliances and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee fading into the background as the conversation deepened. Emily realized that moments like this, though uncomfortable, were necessary, that they could bring clarity and connection rather than division. She reflected briefly on her own feelings, the small stirrings of doubt, longing, and frustration that had grown quietly in her heart, recognizing that this moment with Michael was about more than just him. It was about the fragile web of relationships she navigated every day, the love, loyalty, and honesty that had to coexist in a family that was still learning to blend. Michael paused, searching for the right words, and Emily waited patiently, feeling the tension in the air as both of them recognized the significance of the conversation. Finally, he whispered, "I just want to understand. I don't want things to go wrong, Emily. I don't want our family to fall apart." Her chest tightened, a mixture of sorrow and empathy filling her as she responded gently, assuring him that some truths were complicated, but facing them together could make them stronger, that love and honesty could survive even when life felt fragile. She saw a small, almost imperceptible relief in Michael's expression, a tiny spark of hope that perhaps speaking aloud could ease some of the burden he had been carrying alone. And in that quiet kitchen, with sunlight streaming around them, Emily felt an unexpected connection, not romantic, but deeply human. A shared moment of vulnerability, trust, and care that neither would forget. It was a beginning, she realized, a first step toward understanding, toward confronting the unspoken emotions that lingered between David, Michael, and herself. As she guided Michael toward a comforting silence, letting the weight of the day settle, Emily knew that this conversation would shape the coming days, that it was the start of navigating a complex emotional path with honesty, empathy, and a quiet hope that love could guide them through even the most uncertain moments. And as she turned back to the dishes, her mind lingered on Michael's words, her heart heavy yet strangely light, aware that the story unfolding in their kitchen was only just beginning, that questions asked in the warmth of sunlight could change everything in ways they could not yet imagine. Michael sat across from Emily at the kitchen table, his hands folded nervously as he tried to find the right words, his voice low and uncertain, the quiet ticking of the clock filling the space between them. Emily, sensing the weight of what he wanted to say, leaned in slightly, her eyes soft but alert, ready to guide him through the emotions he could barely put into words. "It's just... things have felt different," Michael began, his gaze dropping to the tabletop, tracing imaginary lines on the worn wood. "Dad, he's been distant. He's always busy, always somewhere else, and even when he's here, it feels like he's not really here. And sometimes I hear things, little phone calls, whispers, moments when he seems different. I don't know who to ask about this, and I don't want to overstep." Emily nodded slowly, understanding the vulnerability in his voice, the mixture of confusion and worry that no child should have to carry alone. She could feel her heart tightening. Hearing his honest observations brought an ache she hadn't anticipated, because she too had noticed the subtle shifts, the way David sometimes seemed lost in thoughts Emily couldn't reach, the way smiles were shorter, conversations more strained, and moments of tenderness fleeting. Michael's eyes lifted briefly, glimmering with unshed tears, and Emily reached out instinctively, letting her hand rest gently on his. "You're right to notice," she said softly, "and it's okay to feel what you're feeling. You don't have to carry this alone." For the next few minutes, he spoke in fits and starts, explaining little incidents he had observed, the hurried phone calls he wasn't meant to hear, the times his father had promised something and then canceled without explanation, the sudden distance that had crept into their family life. Emily listened patiently, holding her own emotions in check, aware that this moment was about his need to be heard and understood, not about her own worries. As he spoke, she realized that Michael was grappling not just with confusion about his father's behavior, but with a fear of losing the sense of stability he had always counted on, and she felt a surge of empathy for him. She encouraged him gently, asking questions that helped him articulate feelings he hadn't been able to fully name, guiding him through the maze of uncertainty without judgment. She reminded him that noticing changes didn't mean he was betraying anyone, and that seeking clarity was a sign of courage, not weakness. Michael's voice grew steadier, more confident, as he began to trust that Emily would respond with honesty and care rather than criticism or alarm. Emily thought about how delicate these moments were, how easily misunderstandings could grow into larger fears if left unspoken. She realized that being present for him now could prevent years of miscommunication, could help him navigate his emotions before they festered into resentment or distance. She spoke calmly about the importance of observing without assuming, of being honest yet compassionate. And Michael nodded, absorbing her words with the quiet seriousness of someone who felt both relief and still a lingering anxiety. They moved on to specific incidents, times when David had been absent or distracted, and Emily helped Michael frame them in a way that made sense without escalating fear, showing him that adult relationships could be complicated, that sometimes people acted in ways that were confusing, but not necessarily harmful. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from observation to emotion, and Michael began to open up about his own feelings of longing for connection, his desire for his father to be the attentive parent he remembered, and his fear that the family's bonds were shifting in ways beyond his control. Emily felt a mixture of sorrow and hope as she listened, recognizing the bravery in his willingness to express himself, and she encouraged him to continue, creating a safe space where emotions could be shared without judgment or consequence. She shared small, empathetic reflections of her own, reinforcing that feelings of confusion, disappointment, and longing were normal, that love could coexist with frustration, and that noticing distance didn't mean a family was breaking. It meant they had an opportunity to understand each other better. The light through the kitchen window shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening, but neither of them noticed immediately. Their focus was entirely on the dialogue unfolding, on the trust being built across the table. Emily could see that Michael's tension was slowly easing, that speaking aloud was giving form to feelings that had been swirling inside him for weeks, and she felt a profound connection to him, one based on mutual respect, care, and the shared goal of preserving family unity. She guided him gently toward the realization that some answers would require patience and careful communication, that not every question would have a simple response, but that facing uncertainty together could be a form of strength. As the conversation drew toward a pause, Emily reassured him that she would be there, that they could navigate the complexities of life and relationships one step at a time, and that honesty, even when it hurt, was far better than silence. Michael's gaze softened, a hint of relief in his expression, and Emily sensed that a small burden had been lifted, that he felt less alone than he had when he first walked into the kitchen. And as they both sat quietly for a moment, listening to the subtle hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of leaves outside, Emily realized that this conversation was a turning point, not a solution, not a conclusion, but a beginning in which trust, care, and empathy would guide their actions, where emotional honesty could lay the groundwork for healing, and where the fragile yet resilient bonds of their blended family could find footing once more. She knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and tension, but in that kitchen, in the afternoon light, she saw a glimmer of hope, a quiet promise that with attention, patience, and love, they could navigate the uncertainties of adult relationships, teenage fears, and the intricate dance of family life. And as Michael finally pushed back his chair slightly and took a deep breath, Emily smiled softly, knowing that sometimes simply listening, simply being present, could be the most powerful act of love, and that this conversation, though ordinary on the surface, had created a foundation strong enough to carry them through the delicate days to come. The following days felt heavy with unspoken tension, but Emily noticed a subtle change in Michael. He seemed more willing to share his thoughts, more open to discussing the emotions he had been quietly carrying, and she realized that the trust they had built in the kitchen conversation had created a fragile yet promising bridge between them. One evening, as the golden light of sunset spilled across the living room and kitchen, Michael found her preparing dinner again, the soft clatter of pots and pans filling the air, and he hesitated before speaking, his voice low and tinged with vulnerability. "Emily," he began, glancing at the counter, "I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other day, about Dad, and everything feels so complicated. I don't know what to feel sometimes." Emily paused, turning slightly to face him, her heart warming at his honesty and her mind racing with ways to guide him without adding to his confusion. She motioned for him to sit, and he obeyed, his shoulders tight with the weight of unsaid worries. He described more incidents that had puzzled him, the sudden mood changes in David, moments when he had seemed distant even during family dinners, and nights when he had whispered to himself on the phone or left the house abruptly. Each detail Michael shared painted a picture of a family caught in subtle turbulence, where the bonds that seemed stable on the surface were quietly tested beneath. Emily listened intently, keeping her own emotions in check, sensing that this was more than a teenager's curiosity. It was a plea for clarity, a search for reassurance, and a desperate need to understand his father's heart. She nodded thoughtfully, responding with gentle encouragement, telling him that noticing changes didn't mean he was responsible or that the family was doomed, that feelings of uncertainty were natural and part of navigating relationships. Michael's eyes flickered with both relief and lingering fear, and Emily reached out to lightly touch his hand again, a grounding gesture to remind him that he was not alone. As the conversation deepened, Emily shared small reflections from her own experience with David, careful, honest, yet framed in a way that preserved respect and dignity, illustrating that adult relationships could be complicated, that distance didn't always mean betrayal, and that emotions, even when messy, could lead to growth and understanding. Michael's posture relaxed slightly, the tension in his jaw softening as he realized that sharing these worries was not a burden, but a step toward clarity. Emily asked questions that helped him articulate feelings he hadn't been able to name, drawing out his fears about losing connection, about misreading signals, and about the fragility of family trust. She encouraged him to see that emotions were not always logical, that sometimes confusion and hurt were intertwined, and that facing those feelings openly could prevent them from building into resentment. The afternoon light shifted to the warm hues of early evening, yet neither noticed immediately, both immersed in the quiet intimacy of emotional honesty, where no judgment existed, only understanding and care. Emily could feel the delicate balance between guiding him and letting him discover truths on his own. It was a dance of empathy and patience, and she navigated it with a gentle focus, knowing that every word could shape his perception of family, trust, and love. Michael spoke about longing for moments of connection with his father, about missing the ease they once shared, about small gestures that now seemed fleeting or inconsistent. Emily listened, validating his emotions without offering false reassurances, reminding him that relationships evolved, that love could coexist with distance, and that noticing shifts was a sign of attentiveness, not blame. She helped him frame incidents with perspective, showing that sometimes adults struggled to balance work, responsibilities, and emotions, and that interpreting actions required context, patience, and compassion. Michael nodded, absorbing her words, and for the first time in days, a sense of calm began to settle over him. A feeling that even if everything wasn't perfectly understood, he was not alone in navigating the emotional terrain of his family. Emily felt a surge of protective affection for him, not romantic, but deeply human, a connection rooted in care, trust, and the shared need for understanding. She reminded him gently that he could always ask questions, always express feelings, and that honesty, when shared respectfully, could be a source of strength rather than conflict. Michael's voice grew steadier as he described moments of confusion and fear, the uncertainty about what was happening with his father, and Emily helped him translate that anxiety into words, a process that made the invisible weight in his chest feel lighter. They talked about hope, about patience, and about the importance of observing, understanding, and waiting for clarity without rushing to conclusions or harsh judgments. The kitchen, usually a place of routine and domestic chores, had transformed into a quiet sanctuary where emotions could be explored safely, and Emily sensed that these conversations were knitting new threads of trust, compassion, and resilience into the fabric of their family life. As the evening wore on, she saw Michael's posture ease completely, his earlier stiffness replaced by a tentative relaxation, and she knew that this was progress, a small but significant step toward bridging gaps that had begun to form. Emily also reflected on her own feelings, on the subtle distance she sometimes felt from David, on the ways emotions and misunderstandings could accumulate silently, and she realized that creating these moments of open dialogue with Michael was not only helping him, but preparing her to approach her husband with empathy and clarity. She guided him gently toward the understanding that some answers would take time, that emotions were not always immediately solvable, and that patience, kindness, and honesty could transform confusion into connection. Michael looked at her, eyes bright with the first sparks of hope, and whispered, "I feel better just talking to you, like maybe things can be okay." Emily smiled softly, feeling her own heart lift at the simplicity and sincerity of his words. And as the day faded into evening, with shadows stretching across the kitchen floor, Emily realized that while questions remained unanswered and uncertainty still lingered, the act of facing emotions together, of listening and validating, had created a foundation strong enough to navigate the delicate and often complex relationships of a blended family. The conversation, though challenging, had built trust, reinforced bonds, and reminded both of them that care, empathy, and gentle honesty were the tools that could guide them through the emotional storms ahead. And in that quiet kitchen, with the lingering scent of dinner and the warmth of fading sunlight, Emily and Michael shared a moment of understanding that neither would forget. A moment that promised that even amidst confusion, love, attention, and patience could illuminate the path forward, slowly, carefully, and with hope. The days after that quiet conversation in the kitchen felt different, a subtle shift that Emily could sense in both herself and Michael, as though acknowledging hidden truths had lifted a weight they didn't even realize they'd been carrying. And while the questions about David's behavior had not yet been fully answered, there was now a sense of cautious hope threading through their interactions, a gentle reassurance that honesty and care could guide them forward. Emily noticed Michael becoming more observant, yet less anxious, his steps lighter, his voice more relaxed, and she understood that allowing him to share his thoughts had given him a space to process his feelings without fear or judgment, and in turn, it gave her insight into the emotional currents flowing through the family. One evening, as she was preparing dinner with the familiar rhythm of chopping and stirring, David returned home earlier than expected, the sound of his footsteps blending with the soft hum of the refrigerator, and Emily's heart beat faster. Not with panic, but with the awareness that the delicate equilibrium they had built could be tested at any moment. Michael, seated nearby, glanced briefly at Emily, a silent communication passing between them that said, "We're ready for this." David's presence filled the kitchen, his usual warmth mingling with the lingering tension that neither Emily nor Michael tried to hide. And for a brief moment, time seemed to stretch as the three of them existed in a shared space of unspoken understanding, where emotions hung delicately in the air. Emily greeted him calmly, the normalcy of her voice concealing the careful thought she had given to the days leading up to this moment. And she sensed that Michael, too, was preparing to navigate the conversation that might arise naturally from what he had been feeling. David smiled, unaware of the internal dialogues his son and wife had been carrying, and Emily felt a mixture of affection, worry, and anticipation, as she realized that this moment, ordinary on the surface, was a turning point in the family's dynamic, a test of patience, empathy, and the ability to communicate without blame or accusation. They began to eat together, the conversation light at first, about the day's errands, small plans for the weekend, the weather, and other safe topics. But Emily noticed subtle glances exchanged between David and Michael, moments where understanding and curiosity sparked, where the awareness of shared concerns lingered just beneath polite conversation. As the meal progressed, Emily found opportunities to gently guide the dialogue toward emotions, toward acknowledgement of the quiet distance that had crept into their home without creating confrontation, and she saw that David, though initially unaware, responded with warmth and openness, his tone softening, his body language attentive, signaling that he was receptive to connection in ways he hadn't realized he was missing. Michael, encouraged by Emily's calm presence, asked small, thoughtful questions, not probing or accusatory, but seeking understanding, and Emily could see the gradual unfolding of trust and clarity, the slow unraveling of confusion that had weighed heavily on him. She reflected on how fragile and precious such moments were, recognizing that communication in families often relied on subtle cues, patience, and the willingness to listen without immediate judgment, and she felt a quiet pride in the way Michael had begun to articulate his feelings and in the way David responded with empathy and thoughtfulness. Later, as they cleared the table together, Emily observed a new ease in their interactions, a warmth that had been missing for weeks, subtle smiles exchanged, laughter returning in small doses. And she realized that while challenges remained, the willingness to be emotionally present and honest had already begun to mend gaps that had seemed unbridgeable. She spoke softly to Michael, acknowledging his courage in expressing his concerns and his insight into his father's behavior, and he smiled, a hint of relief and newfound confidence shining through, recognizing that his voice mattered and that his observations were valid and valued. David, noticing the ease in the room, asked Emily about her day and listened attentively, unaware of the depth of reflection and quiet strategizing that had gone into managing the household and family emotions, and Emily felt a deep gratitude for the simple act of his presence, for the opportunity to rebuild trust incrementally and gently. That evening, after Michael had gone to his room, Emily and David shared a quiet moment in the kitchen, the air filled with the gentle aroma of the meal they had prepared together, and she felt compelled to speak, carefully choosing her words to acknowledge the subtle shifts she had observed in both their son and in herself, the ways in which distance and distraction had crept in, and the hope that empathy, attentiveness, and patient dialogue could heal and strengthen their family bond. David listened with a sincerity that surprised her, nodding and reflecting on the patterns she described, expressing a desire to be more present, to notice the little things, and to honor the emotional needs of both his son and his wife. And in that moment, Emily felt the fragile but real promise of renewal, a possibility that even amidst confusion and tension, love and care could illuminate a path forward. She realized that the story of their family was still unfolding, that the questions asked in the kitchen weeks ago had sparked conversations and reflections that were slowly transforming the emotional landscape of their home, creating a space where honesty could thrive without judgment and where understanding could replace assumptions. In the quiet of that evening, as they sat sipping tea and watching the fading sunlight through the windows, Emily felt a gentle sense of accomplishment and hope, aware that while not every question had an immediate answer, the act of addressing emotions, listening deeply, and responding with empathy had created a foundation strong enough to navigate future challenges. Michael's growth, David's attentiveness, and her own patience had combined to create a new rhythm in the household, one that embraced honesty, care, and love without forcing confrontation or discomfort. And as the night settled, Emily reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple, hesitant question in the kitchen. Realizing that even the smallest acts of courage and communication could ripple outward, transforming relationships, easing burdens, and nurturing emotional bonds that were now stronger, more resilient, and more tender than before, promising that the family, though still imperfect and human, could face whatever challenges came next with a quiet confidence rooted in understanding, trust, and the gentle power of shared hearts.